All right. Well, welcome back to our Counseling Community Connection. I am here with Dr. Caulk and Dr. Williams, and we are going to be talking about God's vision for the field of counseling today. And so really what I have in mind for our afternoon here is to give you a little bit of a recap of what we talked about last time. Now, if you haven't heard what we've talked about last time, Huntington University has the YouTube video up so you can look back and see what we've chatted about last time. But really, I mean, some of what we've chatted about in our time together prior was building community. And whether you're watching this afterwards or whether you're joining us right now, really the idea of this time together is to build community. And of course, our program has been online. So this is kind of a new interface for us, even as faculty, as online faculty, and also an online program, and creating a sense of community, a sense of we have a sense of belonging, I think can occur, but there can be some challenges there. So one of the things that we've talked about as a faculty is shared culture. What is a shared culture? And part of it has to do with faith, which we've talked about last time in our time together. We've talked about COVID and our call. And to me, call really has to do with a divine summoning, but really this idea of a divine summoning points to God, points to Jesus. So we invite you in our respective living rooms or offices. I know Dr. E over there has his office set up over there that you can see on the online world, and Dr. Caulk and I have our respective offices. But again, it's kind of to invite you into kind of the living room space. I mean, if we were together, I would kind of imagine sofas, couches, talking together. And so if you are joining us live here, we do ask that if you would have questions or even chat box kind of conversation there, that we invite you into those spaces, those kind of online spaces there, and we'll try to respond back as we can. So we're going to get started here in terms of kind of framing out our conversation. What I mean by that is I'm going to try to stick to about maybe 5 minutes of putting together a framework. Part of it has to do with our mission statement, and part of it has to do with a verse that we've been talking about in Habakkuk 2:2. And the rest of the time is going to be conversation between Dr. E, Dr. Caulk, and myself. And again, part of it is to invite you into what would be kind of like if we said, come on into our faculty meeting and have a conversation with us. And so this is kind of an inside scoop on some regards, or inside view of our conversations of our faculty or your professors, really, if you're in the student body, of what we've been chatting about, what we've been having conversations about, what we've been praying about, or who, really you, the student body, but also the impact of what we do to the outer spheres, right? Our spheres of influence outside into your communities, outside into wherever as students you will be going to, but some of you are supervisors or those who are connected to us through the internship side. Some of you may be in the community in different locations if you're watching later. But it's really to invite you into this conversation of both what's happening HUCMHC, right, our faculty, but also as we are looking outwards, what is God's vision for the field of counseling? And so that's where we're going to focus on in our conversation this morning, is to say, what do you see? Again, we're going to be talking about Habakkuk 2:2 as a framework, and seeing and reclaiming God's vision for the field of counseling. So I'm going to pull up this PowerPoint for us here for us to see together, and we'll get started. So again, the title of our conversation today is, what do you see? And we're talking about reclaiming God's vision for the field of counseling. Now, when I say reclaiming, I think that God already has a vision. He already has something in mind. So I think that word for me has some sort of meaning in terms of how we're going to position ourselves to claim the vision that God already has for us. And when we're talking about vision, we're talking about an overarching kind of a macro view of what God is doing. At the same time, I want to remind us of who we are and what we're doing. And we've talked about this last time, our mission statement, which is here, where it says Huntington University's CMHC program provides Christ-centered counselor training, equipping counselors to engage diverse cultural contexts through the cultivation of clinical skills, critical thinking, and academic excellence. And we've talked about COVID last time and our calling in the midst of it. And this is really centrally what we're doing is we're equipping counselors that are Christ-centered within diverse cultural contexts, and of course, cultivating our clinical skills and critical thinking in the academic context. So this really hones in on what we do, and other aspects of who we are or what we do is to develop the personhood of the counselor through a dynamic process of engaging leadership and students in a variety of contexts, one's own faith and relationship with Christ, and nurturing an emerging counselor identity through personal development and relationship with others. So again, this is what we do. There's a lot of different dynamics here. We're talking about relationship. We're talking about the community of leadership and students together in a variety of contexts. We're talking about faith and relationship with Christ. And this part here, the emerging counselor identity through development, again, from relationships, but this emerging counselor identity that I want to emphasize in the sense of us as a community of counselors, right? As a community of counselors, a community that is in the space of professional counseling. Now, that's a little bit of a conversation for a different day in terms of counselor identity, but I do want to emphasize that we are counselors. Many of us are licensed counselors, and if you're a student in the body, you are pursuing licensure within that field. And we are a growing, developing profession. I think our profession has been around for about a century, which is much less than social work and certainly less than psychology. And we are emerging in our counselor identity as a community as well. And so all of you within the counseling community really have a place of advocacy and development of the identity of the counseling community. And so I want to emphasize that just a little bit as we move forward. But we nurture an emerging counselor identity through our faith and relationship with Christ, which we're going to focus on a little bit here in our chats. So to frame this further, if you haven't caught it yet, today is February 22nd, 2022. And our verse today is in Habakkuk 2:2, really 1 through 3. But this middle part here is 2:2. So if you're like me, a person that likes numbers, you'll see a lot of twos today. And we're going to focus on Habakkuk 2:2. So I'll read this to you. Habakkuk 2:1 through 3 says, I will stand at my guard post and station myself on the watchtower, and I will keep watch to see what he will say to me, and how I may reply when I am reprimanded. Then the Lord answered me and said, this is verse 2, write down the vision and inscribe it clearly on tablets, so that one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hurries towards the goal and it will not fail. Though it delays, wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay long. So I wanted to highlight a few pieces that we've been kind of meditating on as a faculty together. And we're going to be chatting together, Dr. Caulk, Dr. E, and I, in this space. And you're invited as well, if you're here with us live, to chat with us, to ask some questions here as well. But I want to highlight a few pieces here. And I'm going to do that through reading you Matthew Henry's commentary on Habakkuk, just the second chapter. And this is what he says. His standing upon his watch intimates his patience, his constancy and resolution. He will wait the time and weather the point as a watchman does, but he will have an answer. He will know what God will say to him, not only for his own satisfaction, but to enable him as a prophet to give satisfaction to others and answer their exceptions when he is reproved or argued with. So that's the first part that I want to highlight, is this idea of watching to see. And that's something that we've put together in our title, to what do you see? And there's this positioning of Habakkuk. I will stand at the guard post and station myself on the watchtower. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and how I might reply when I am reprimanded. And this idea of having a vision, having something to say when somebody asks you, well, why Christ? Why not somebody else? Why do you even have Christ in the midst of your mission statement? Why is that so important? And for you to have an answer is important. And so this is the Lord's response to Habakkuk. He said, write down the vision after you've attained it, after you've claimed it, write it down, inscribe it clearly on tablets so that one who may read it may run. It's clear. I know what I'm doing. I see what I'm supposed to do. And it gives you that grace to go forward, to run. But the first part there is to watch to see, which can be quite a process. And some of that we're going to chat about as a group today, what that process was like. Our faculty took a couple months actually on this verse and really sat and said, well, what does it mean to reclaim God's vision? What does it mean to watch and see? And all of us, I think, I can say for all of us that we're pretty driven people. And so to wait, and as a culture, students in graduate school and other places, I bet you're pretty driven too, to just wait, to watch, to see. I mean, that can be an excruciating process, but that's counterculture. And that's something that really biblically David did very well. He waited upon the Lord, he drew strength, and then he was made to go forward in the battlefield. And I think that's going to be our trump card. As Christians, as a community, our trump card is going to be God's vision. That's going to be the thing that gives us the grace to move forward, but also it's something that gives us confidence. So this is the exhortation in verse 3. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hurries towards the goal, and it will not fail. Though it delays, wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay long. The Matthew Henry commentary says, God has an appointed time for his appointed work, and will be sure to do the work when the time comes. It's not for us to anticipate his appointments, but to wait his time. And it is a great encouragement to wait with patience, that though the promised favor be deferred long, it will come at last, and be an abundant recompense to us for our waiting. At the end, it shall speak and not lie. We shall not be disappointed of it, for it will come at the time appointed, nor shall we be disappointed in it, for it will fully answer our believing expectations. So again, our faculty has been talking about vision, and you've seen the mission statement that we've put out, and it's nicely well put together, and there's a lot of different dynamics there. But when it comes to vision, in some regards, I think we're a little bit stumped in what it looks like to have this sense of an overarching kind of macro view. So one of the things we talked about last time, departmentally, we have talked about the idea of us as shepherds, that God would raise up shepherds after his own heart in the field of counseling that will lead and guide his people with knowledge and understanding. And this has become central within our faculty of really the idea of shepherding. And in some regards, you as counselors will shepherd others as well. And so there's a space of really having an identity as shepherds that we have gravitated around. And this has been central in our talks and calling and community. Now, in terms of a vision statement, there's a lot of different places to go, articles to read and literature to go to see how to come up with a vision statement. I mean, you can go through Microsoft, you can go through Google, you can go through your favorite, restaurant, In-N-Out, and, it's the thing that sparkles and shines, and you can say it's like your rule the world statement. So we've sat around and saying we need something that is going to do that for us. And you know what? We've really come and centered around this central idea. And I'll show it to you here. Our vision is Christ. Very simply put, our vision is Christ. And of course, we have our mission statement, which elucidates a lot of the different dynamics. But for us to say that the vision ahead of us, the vision that is central, the vision that is really a part of who we are, is Christ, that's a statement. And it might not seem like that if you've already been in the Christian community, grew up in the Bible school, Sunday school answers, Jesus is the answer, those kinds of faith traditions that you might be thinking, well, this is, another one of those, Jesus is the center of everything. And it is, but it's also more than that. There's a place where I mentioned before, it says that Habakkuk says, I will keep watch to see what it will say to me, and I might reply when I am reprimanded. And not so much in a disciplinary way. That word reprimanded, I think, can have kind of a negative connotation, but in the sense of when you say, well, Christ is in the center of all that I do, how do we defend that, right? As a counseling community, a lot of us are licensed, and our movement as a department, we are moving into the accreditation phase with CACREP in the coming years. And there are many universities that don't have Christ in the midst of it. So what does that mean for us, right? Our vision is Christ. And this is essentially the conversation that I want you to be a part of this morning as we're talking, is the fundamental question that we're going to start with is, if our vision is Christ, why does Christ belong in the field of counseling? And you're going to hear from Dr. E, Dr. Caulk, and myself of kind of answering that question. But I want you to consider that as you are hearing this, is why does Christ belong in the field of counseling? Some of you may be steeped in faith traditions that Christ was a center of places. Some of you may be in secular institutions and other places where your faith tradition didn't encompass that as well. And so there's a congruence there within where you work and in what you believe. And some places may be an incongruence as well. But what I'm asking for is to, as you're hearing our conversation, that you engage in the conversation by asking yourself as well, why does Christ belong in the field of counseling? Consider your fundamental worldview, right? Sometimes we just take it for granted that we believe in God, we have certain cultural contexts, we go to church on Sunday, we do different things, but we never ask ourselves, where does that come from, right? And so to consider your fundamental worldview. And the other part is where, if you've been in my integration class, we've asked this question before, is what does it mean to integrate, right? And that very phrase of integration denotes the fact that there's something to be integrated, meaning there's a split, right? So is there a split between Christ and the world? Is there a way that it comes together, right? And that's just a fundamental question of your integrative stance, the way in which you think about a biblical worldview of Christ belongs in counseling, but it's really taking shape in different forms, right? And so I'm going to start with whoever wants to start here, Dr. Caulk or Dr. E. And I'm just going to start out our conversation and ask, why does Christ belong in the field of counseling?
Well, I think first, it is an incredibly complex, messy, ongoing kind of question to answer. There's no one, I think, absolute way to proceed through this conversation that leads us to, well, this is the ultimate black and white kind of answer. Really what we're doing here, I think, is making our way through that messiness of our own histories, of our own upbringings, of our own view of counseling and human suffering in the way that I think kind of positions us as integrators in progress. Not that we necessarily, have the ultimate answer to how we integrate. And I been over a lifetime of the work that we're called to do, that we continually press into this question, that we continually understand how to integrate. Um, but I would say that just kind of getting down into the calling, but then we also have this idea that alongside suffering and pain is, on the other hand, and how we integrate this, is this idea of healing and hope of things to come. And where do we source then that healing and hope of things to come? And for us at Huntington, our program, that healing and hope to come is Jesus. But we also recognize him backing it up into the suffering and the pain, because he essentially has gone first, right, with the suffering and the pain. And he can make something meaningful out of that. And so by extension, we as counselors can make something meaningful out of the pain as well. And it goes back a little bit. I think about Hebrews 4:15, in that we don't have this high priest. We don't have this person that is set so far above us that he doesn't empathize with our suffering, because he has suffered first, right, in humanity. And so we kind of take this model that we have of suffering, and we say, what do we need to do with that in the therapeutic room? Mm-hmm. And I'll pause and let Dr. E also speak, because I think I could go on and on.
No, I think that was great. And, you touched on quite a few points there that kind of had my mind going quite a bit. And so I want to kind of start off kind of with a bit of a story, because I think it kind of speaks to this question in such a way. So the question is really, why is Christ, or why is it important for Christ to be in counseling? And it's interesting because in my earlier, and I'll just say earlier than now days of counseling, I once had a client that also attended the same church that I attended. So it was interesting because this person was told by the church that they should not seek an outside counselor, that they should only see somebody within the church, because we basically, outside counselors were not also, I guess, cut from the same cloth, I guess, is probably a nice way of putting it, which was really very interesting, because I'm like, I go to that church. So it's interesting how in some areas of the world, there is this belief that people who do counseling that are not a part of the church, there's this I don't know, a way of not including us, or seeing that, hey, you know what, we can also be people of Christ. We're also believers. We just operate under a different set of rules, or we may also have a different set of ethics. And so I think that's important, because sometimes people do believe that. And I think this question really speaks to, we do have to see that Christ is in counseling, whether this person is working in a particular church or in some type of religious setting, or even if they're out in a private practice setting. So when I think about this, I also had this kind of rhetorical question of, well, what if Christ wasn't in counseling? What would that look like? What would that really be like? And it's really hard to imagine that, because a lot of the principles in which we look at the field of counseling and how we relate to clients really mirrors and parallels how Christ was able to influence people when he was here. And so when I think about the idea of just being objective, we talk about being very objective and non-biased in counseling. That is very much a spiritual and a Christ, very Christian characteristic. And so when we see the field of counseling and it not also involve Christ, I think even when we say this person may not have a certain faith that may be in the counseling field, a lot of what they're being, a lot of the skills they use are very much Christ infused and Christ influenced. And I think that's the challenge some of us have. So when I thought about it, I was like, well, can we really have a field that is not inspired and by Christ? And I was like, I just don't see how that could be, because in another way, just something else to kind of capture here, how could only the church do or meet the needs of everybody. We've seen over history, over time, that has been a challenge in a lot of places for the church to do this. And so I think in a lot of ways, we've kind of been tasked with this calling. It's not even a task. We've been kind of called to kind of help out in that capacity too, where Christ says, look, these are also other people that may not be operating within the church setting, but also around the church setting, within the communities, that can also do some of the same things Christ was doing when he was out going door to door, or he was within the communities. And so I think we've been called to kind of answer that for a lot of people. And that's something that's been really powerful. I think, when I think about the work that we do, the teachings that we do, a lot of what we're doing, I can't see how I could separate the Christ out of this. Even if this was not a Christian university, I could be in any other university. There's this very Christ-based approach to teaching clients, to teaching students how to be empathetic, how to be compassionate, how to share a story, how to create space, a safe space for people to share a story, and how to really overcome tough struggles and be connected more to themselves, be connected to others, as well as be more connected to Christ. So I like this question because I think I can probably go on about this for quite some time, but there is really a challenge, I would say, to separating this out, which is interesting because a lot of people do see us very separate. There's no Christ in counseling. Like, yes, there is. Everything about counseling is Christ. What do you mean? But that's something that I think a lot of times we do have to kind of answer that question and make sure people in the community can understand that as well.
Yeah, that's really good, Dr. E. Yeah, as I'm hearing both of you talk, I'm thinking about the idea of implicit and explicit integration. And when I hear you talk, Dr. E, I think about characteristics, and I connect that to implicit, right? These qualities or characteristics that are intrinsic to the nature of Christ, that connects to you as a person that relates to him, and that is enacted within the way in which you relate to others. And that relating to others, you've touched on that a little bit too, in terms of certain interventions, certain ways in which we can connect with clients. Again, that can be explicit in the sense of prayer, forgiveness, those particular explicit interventions, or again, it can be in the way in which you behave or that you interact with those individuals as well. And again, as I've been thinking about that framework, thinking about what I've phrased as a theology of suffering. I think you mentioned, Dr. Caulk, just this idea of suffering in a way to understand suffering in the midst of counseling, that we need to know really the man of suffering, the person that has suffered and has passed through. Again, there's a place there, both implicitly and explicitly, where I think we suffer together with our clients as Christ suffered with us. And so there's this place where answering the question of why does Christ belong in there, I think there are some answers to that that we've put out. I know that within the back doors of our faculty meeting, I remember Dr. Caulk, you mentioned, well, I think I moved to the how of counseling and in Christ, and backtracking to the why is kind of a process. And I think it was for me too, backtracking to why. I mean, why are we even asking that question, right? And some of it, I think, has become more apparent as we're talking, is saying, well, if we give the pat answer of, yeah, of course Christ belongs in everywhere, how do we answer that, right? It's the Habakkuk, how do we answer when we're reprimanded? How do we reply? And that's a space where I think we're presenting some of our views here. Of course, I've heard both of you say you could be talking for quite a bit of time, but these are some frames in talking about that. I want to connect this question. I know there's other thoughts percolating here, but I want to connect this question of why does Christ belong in the field of counseling? And I want to connect it to what was the process of waiting on God's vision like for you? In terms of maybe even answering this question, why does Christ belong in the field of counseling? Waiting for God's vision on what his idea of counseling might be, or any of the above or more. What was the process of waiting on God's vision like for you? What emerged for you?
Well, I think to the point is that while integration is a very human process, as we figure out the why do we integrate and how do we integrate, part of the process was for me to be reminded that we're not responsible for initiating God's work in this world. He is responsible for that, and he already is. So, in a sense, we are called to a very simple but still incredibly difficult task of waiting and seeing what that vision is as God is already at work here. And the visual that came to mind, I'm a very visual person, was essentially us moving into the slipstream of God, and not necessarily just going along with it because we're called to a certain measure of obedience, right? To even step into the slipstream. But yet at the same time, we're really just called to simply pay attention to what God is saying to us. And to me, that was a breath of, okay, this is okay. This I can do. Because we should be attuned to this idea. I think that that God is responsible and he acts in the missional field. All the field is missional to him. He thankfully brings himself to us into the field of counseling. And I would say a little bit that even counseling that's not specifically attuned to God, it still is God breathed, just simply because of common grace. So we can fit into the slipstream with common grace. We can fit into the slipstream with this missional field in mind, with the source of Christ and suffering and meaningful life in mind. But for me personally, when I was waiting on God's vision, I am more of a pragmatic kind of, what do I need to know? I don't know if that's just the nature of having a doctorate. Maybe we've been trained too well in that.
Absolutely.
What do I need to know and when is it due? So this was a really sweet reminder to say, just kind of essentially slow. You don't have to know everything because God already does.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that, Michelle, because I think there's this, or Dr. Caulk, I think there's this idea that I think some people approach the field with, that believe that I have to already know exactly what I'm going to do. And I think sometimes as educators, we kind of do that to the students as well. It's like, hey, so here's some different fields you can go into. What do you want to do? And then we say, go to practicum, internship. What do you want to do? And they have to decide. But generally, that's kind of different from the vision. And those are two separate things. And I think sometimes, as you were kind of pointing out, just that idea of waiting and just creating that space, I think is very important. I can share that my experience for waiting for the vision, or what the process is for the vision, has been primarily just being silent and listening for what the next steps are. And what I've kind of come to learn is, and I don't mind sharing this, I think I've shared it with students already, is I didn't know I was going to get a PhD in counseling. As a matter of fact, I have a master's in licensed marriage and family therapy. That's that was my background. That's my master's. And at that time, I really didn't want to go into that field. I was trying to go into clinical psychology. So as you can see, I didn't necessarily know the process, but I didn't know what the vision was, but I was being patient and listening. And I ended up in a marriage and family therapy program. And then I finished and I went in the military. And then I got out and I was like, oh, I'm going to live in this state. And then I'm going to work in community mental health. So I work in community mental health, and I was able to get the the community mental health degree, licensure. And then I got a PhD 12 years after I finished my master's, and said, hey, you know what, this is what you should be doing, because a friend of mine convinced me that this is where you need to go, because it was a Christian university, it was a regional university. So look, you need to go to this school. And I did, and I completed it. And then I had a friend of mine that used to work here at Huntington says, look, you should work here and be an adjunct. And then I came here, and then I did a visiting faculty role, and then now I'm full time. And so, but at no point could you have told me back when I was 18, 19, that this is where I would be, because I didn't like school enough back then to say that I would be a professor. And here I am now. So I think there's a space that when you are open to having a relationship with Christ, you say, look, you know what? I will go where you want me to go. But also being aware that in this field, there are many, many spaces you can fill. And so I remain very centered in my relationship with Christ and very open to what is the next direction for me to travel. And so I've been able to teach here, and I've been able, I also have worked in community mental health. And I think a lot of times the question is, where does God want me to go and influence people? Whether it be influencing clients, do I need to influence students? Do I need to have an influence on other professionals, maybe in a conference? But I think the idea of waiting for the process, or the process of what that vision is just being very silent and listening and making moves when God asks me to, but also knowing that there is no end to the vision. It's constantly evolving. And so what it is today at this point, I'm here at HU. I'm able to have an influence on some clients and students at this point. What it will be another year from now, 5 years from now, it's up to God to tell me. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons that I would hope that every student will be able to walk away from, is just knowing that the vision will evolve, and it will continue to evolve. Even once you're licensed or you may have a career going, it will continue to evolve, and just be open to that process.
Yeah, I love that. There's a couple themes I think that I've been hearing in kind of both of the things, the conversations that you've been having. And one is, I think the word that you used, Dr. Caulk, was common grace. And this idea, I think it's where it says it rains on the unrighteous and the righteous both. And there's this common grace that comes in the farmer who believed in God, rain falls, their crops grow. But the person who didn't, the farmer who didn't believe in God, still benefits from the rain coming and watering their crops, right? It rains on the unrighteous and the righteous both. At the same time, what I hear from you, Dr. E, is that there's a space when you believe unto God, there's a process that although we don't have to figure it out, God figures it out for us, right? There's that place where he who began a good work in us will bring it to completion. So there's kind of those couple of themes that I've been picking up on in terms of kind of how we're perceiving God in our lives. And if you are listening to this later on, I would encourage you to kind of delve in and to see what are the themes that have emerged about my belief in God, right? And some things might be hidden because they're so common. Maybe you've been in the church for a long time, and so you probably could earn a PhD already for the amount of time that you spend in pews, right? It's so much time there that you could already have the hours there to get a doctorate. And for the time that we've been in pews, learning about the love of God, who of us can really say I've experienced the love of God and know him really experientially? I think some of us can, but some of us wrestle with it. I wrestle with it. And so there's a space where there's process, and the living God, relational God, starts to interact with us as human beings, which have all of the facets of cognition, of emotion, all of the places of humanness, right? He interacts with. And then we can say something like, okay, so I don't know how this happened, but I think it's God, right? In some ways, it seems like the simple gives way to the complex, gives back way to the simplicity, right? And so we're talking about waiting on God's vision and answering somewhat, why does Christ belong in the field of counseling? The other piece that I wanted to really kind of have us share with you is, when we consider God's vision, as we have been, and really looking at God's vision for the field of counseling, what do we see, right? What do we see that God wants to happen in the counseling field, right? And so that's something that I'm curious to hear from both of you as well, is does it see Does God have a view of counseling? I mean, that's interesting to me when we look at it from a nitty-gritty point of view, is like having Jesus sitting in one of Dr. E's theories class. Like, what theoretical orientation would you subscribe to, Jesus? Right? It's kind of, in terms of a nitty-gritty way, it's kind of to say, what's God's vision for the field of counseling? Maybe counsel has been a part of the depths of the personhood of Jesus Christ, as he is the fount of wisdom from the very foundations of the earth. And now we have clinical mental health counseling. And so moving from why does Christ belong is like, okay, centrally Christ does belong. So what is it? What is the vision that God has for counseling? I'm curious to hear.
Yeah. I don't mind. So I think it's interesting that we have these discussions, and I kind of shared a quick situation. We were in the internship class, I think last semester, and the question came up, essentially, what is a Christian counselor? And we had been talking about it because we were talking about, I think, the way that we approach certain cases, and then some of the students work in, maybe more private practice settings, some in community mental health, some were in like nonprofits. Like, it was just and so the question kind of came up, what is a Christian counselor? Like, what can you do as a Christian in certain counseling spaces? And as Dr. Lee was just mentioning, I teach a theories course, which in that class, it is a lot of information based on the different theories. And one thing that I always encourage the students to embrace and to consider is you are a brand. And so when you create yourself, or you envision yourself as a brand, when you go out as a counselor, you do not have to be like every other counselor. You don't have to be like Carl Rogers or Albert Ellis or Dr. Lee or Dr. Caulk or even me. You don't have to be like us. You have to develop what that is for you, and pick up theoretical orientation that fits well for who you are, what fits you naturally. And that comes also with what matches your spiritual identity. Because a lot of times people feel, and I've seen students that will kind of feel like, I have to pick a particular theoretical orientation because it is evidence-based. And I was like, well, a lot of them could be evidence-based. Some may just be in the works right now, but just knowing that the ones that may not be evidence-based yet are still just as effective, but it's also, how do you work with that? And how do you also marry that with your spiritual identity, your just who you are as a Christian? And putting those two together is always important. And so I do think that when we think about counseling and just who we are as counselors and our approach to working with other individuals, we want to be very considerate of, how do I also make sure that what I'm doing fits the relationship I have with Christ, and it doesn't jeopardize that too. And again, counseling is great when you get into it, but sometimes as counselors or even students, we may find ourselves a little bit uncomfortable with certain approaches because it may not fit well with us and our way of being as a Christian, or just our spiritual identity. So I think this is where, this question comes up, is, well, what is my brand? And it's my hope that every student that finishes this program can walk away from this just kind of considering, well, what is my brand as a Christian counselor? Because there's different ways to be a Christian counselor. There's no one way to do it. But also have that way influenced by that relationship you have with Christ, because that piece is very, very important. And your theoretical orientation is very much tied into that as well. So my hope is, and as we kind of get into this discussion a little bit more, maybe within a classroom setting, it is to challenge us to think beyond what it means just to learn how to be a counselor here, but also, how do I also become a complete person that is working under the influence of Christ to minister in some way to other people? So just kind of my thoughts on that when you bring that up, because this is a very passionate topic for me that I think I really enjoy when the students bring it up, but I also like the opportunity to speak about it now, because I hope that this can foster additional conversations as we move forward beyond just this hour that we have today.
Yeah, it's an important question, and I love the nuances that you're talking about there, Dr. Williams, with your students, as far as Am I a Christian counselor, or am I a counselor who's Christian? And that's a process for each individual to work out in their counseling identity. And again, a very complex question, but the encouragement there is, I think, to continue to seek out deeper understanding too of these theories, these approaches, these models in which counseling is built on, particularly too because psychology and counseling hasn't always played well in the sandbox, right? With bringing spirituality and faith into the room. That's been a fairly new concept. And so how we're thinking about that is incredibly important, not only just kind of theoretically, but affects the work that we do in the room. And one of the questions that I've kind of parked on and really thought a lot about recently due to our conversations is how do we view Jesus' life and work? And how does that influence how we work with our clients in the room? So, for example, do we tend to really focus, like I do, on the Christmas season and Jesus' birth and the redemptive hope that's so inherent in the innocence and the good, the beginning of Jesus' life? And that may affect how we work with our clients. Are we hope-based? Do we see that our clients' stories are so full of this idea of change and hopefulness and strengths-based? Or do we tend to focus in on, Jesus' ministry while he was here on earth? And that is loaded with advocacy and social justice ideas and, ideas of fitting with cultural diversity, but still being in this place of knowing who you are. How does that affect our work in the room as counselors?
Right.
It's a good question, I think, to ask as far as where do we center just naturally our vision or our relationship with Christ throughout his work and his life? Are we focused on the cross where, there's redemption for sin there? So interesting thoughts.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And as I'm hearing you both talk, it's I've used the word integration at the start of this conversation. But another word that I think about is the interface, right? How are these views interfacing with each other? And when I hear you, Dr. E, I hear this sense of evangelism, right? The sense of a missional kind of idea of going out, right? And of course, that stems from somewhere for you, and it can connect to the field of counseling in a very specific way, right? And so again, as you're hearing Dr. E and Dr. Caulk talk about their own processes of how these spaces interface, I would encourage you to look at your own processes, right? There's these themes that Dr. Caulk is talking about in terms of, are we talking about the cross? Are we talking about certain things in Christmas time and the Advent season and those kinds of places? Those, seem to be on some regards very common, but they're not. I mean, there are places within cultures that do not have, I was driving down the road and there was a church and there was another church right beside it. And I was thinking, this is interesting. I am glad for it, but it's an interesting kind of phenomenon in the Western culture. I would say even predominantly in our Western culture, the Judeo-Christian worldview is actually a part of the culture. I mean, it's part of it in a way where it's not uncommon for somebody to know the gospel narrative in some way. And that's not common in other places. And so the way in which we have interpreted the gospel narrative and applied it, that in between space, I think that's where, that's where we've had crusades, that's where we've had church splits, we've had all kinds of different places that have created division, right? And so when I think about interfacing or integration and going back to our central statement, our vision is Christ, right? I think there's a commonality there. We're alluding to it. I think there's more I get to spend time with Dr. Caulk and Dr. E, every week, but there's time to spend with these individuals and your colleagues and other students of really delving into what is that really about for you? What does that mean? How does Christ centrally, who is he even? Are we just saying Jesus Christ in name? Does he, I probably couldn't name all of his family members and brothers, but if we confess to know Jesus, do we know his family system? Do we have a genogram of Jesus and kind of where he comes from and those kinds of things, right? And so there's a depth of conversation here that I think I just want to kind of tip my hat to, because there's a lot there. But I also want to kind of move this into the direction of the vision for kind of our department, and how does all of what we talked about impact the way in which we see God's vision for our department, right? And again, I've heard things around, a missional view, the interfacing between theories and kind of the evangelism kind of piece of it. I've heard a theology of suffering. I've heard, the centrality of the cross. I've heard a lot of these different places. But when we focus in on kind of Huntington University and clinical mental health counseling, and we say our vision is Christ, and you can read the mission statement in the PowerPoint, how does this impact? How does all of that impact the way in which we see God's vision for our department?
I think it's I want to make sure I say this in a way that doesn't negate or create any tension. But one of the things I think about with where we are, because we have new faculty coming in, the three of us, and we are tasked with continuing the torch for the department. And what I do believe that under this new leadership for the department, we are very much in our infancy stage. And we're building this program to become something very very instrumental for the development of the community around us here, or there, because I'm in North Carolina, there in the Huntington area, Fort Wayne area, but also across the state of Indiana, and then across the larger area, the United States. And so when I think about the department, I always kind of go back to every person that comes into our program has come to us because they've been called to do this type of work, and they are under us to really help their light shine a little bit more. So I don't doubt that most people who come here already have counseling capabilities. They have what it takes to meet people where they are and to really help them overcome whatever struggles or burdens or life stresses they may have. But they may not have it I think about the rough ashlar versus a perfect ashlar metaphor. And I think in this capacity, we help make them a more perfect version of what God has called them to do. And so our vision for this department is to really help take off some of the rougher edges and to really improve some of the skill sets and the ways that they can interact and interface with the larger community around them, whether it be within their own community or if they decide to go into other places and within the world. Our task is really to help that person's skill set shine before others so that God can really witness the greatness in what they're doing. And in some capacity, if this turns into a situation where these individuals are out here and they are able to draw people closer to Christ, that is also just as exciting. But in a lot of cases, the primary mission is to go out and help those in need. And our job as a faculty, as a department, is to really create a curriculum that really speaks to and focuses on the strengths that each student comes in with, but also stretches them to a capacity to say, look, you know what, I had never practiced it this way. I've never been able to use these skills this way, but then they become more comfortable with the uncomfortable and go out and do a lot of great things for other people as well. So those are my thoughts on it. And I'll try to be short, but I'll leave the rest for Dr. Caulk.
And Dr. Lee too.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, well, I think we do all of this in the context of being known and within relationship. And that has been one of our challenges. And I just got a question from a prospective student that she said, I understand that you all are mostly an online program. So how do you foster deep relationships? And I am really being thoughtful and prayerful about answering that question in a way that not only says, well, we have a newsletter and we get together, once a year at the beginning of the program for the intensive, and we're always available to you. But to understand the deeper question, I think behind that, or the deeper need, is the need for how are we going to do relationship together? And I think that there's that understanding, which is so good to me. There's an understanding that we don't change, we don't grow, we don't use our skill sets outside of relationship with others. And that's really, I think, what we have been intentional about between the three of us in the time since we've all been together as faculty, is to build this foundational relationship of this commonality of Christ. But then who are we in God? And that's what we have to offer our students as well, is this parallel process of who has God created you to be? And the finer points of, okay, great, what theoretical orientation, are you drawn to? What kind of specific population do you want to work with? Is your heart for children? Is it for those wily, adolescents? God love you if you're drawn to adolescents. If it's for couples, whatever that is. But there's also this great beauty in the individuality that we're recognizing in our own different skill sets and our backgrounds. Because there's this idea of this unity. So diversity and unity, I think, work best when they work together, right? That's kind of the option. And that's really, I think, what's emerging here as the vision of our department, as we are both standing and watching to see what God has for us and our students, but it's also engaging with one another. We're listening well. We're engaging well with one another and recognizing our strengths and our skills. And we're having these conversations about the theoretical, about the psychological, about the spiritual, in the hopes that then, of course, that filters down to all of our students. So, I think it's the vision also takes some action. So I don't believe that we're just sitting and waiting for, this vision to all of a sudden fall onto our heads. What we're really doing here, and I'm picturing the watchman at his guard post. He's standing out there in the wind, the rain, the snow. If you live in the Midwest, we've gotten a lot of snow this season. He's standing out there in the elements. And he's also actively choosing to be there. He's actively choosing to stay. There's action going on here. He's recognizing and waiting, and he's trusting in God. And I think that's what we have been trying to do over the last many months as we look for God's vision.
That's a good statement, I think, to kind of ponder. And again, the word community has come up a couple of times, and I think that's the place where one of the theories, not so much embedded within psychology, maybe slightly in psychology and sociology, is Cooley's looking glass theory. And it's this idea that we are known and we know who we are because others know us, right? And so there's this reflection that we have in others that helps to form identity. And then there's also kind of what Dr. Caulk was saying is kind of this watchman individual kind of space, right? Watching to see and having a relationship with God. So simply put, it's kind of the first and second commandment, right? Love God, love others, and in there is a summation of really the thing that God wants us to do. And so really, I mean, again, complex to simple, we come back around to our vision is Christ. We come back around to, okay, it's the first and second commandment, love God, love others. But again, I think there's a place where the word you used, Dr. E, was tension. There's a place to stand in the tension. And what other tension is there between the poles, the cross, right? Suffering, the place to hold tension between the waiting of the redemption of mankind and the suffering of mankind is the cross, and the redemption there is Jesus in the midst of it, right? And so I think that's where I will land, in terms of saying our vision is Christ, and have some clarity in what that means. I mean, I think the simplest statements sometimes confound us, but also answer the most profound questions. And so if that's some comfort to you, that it's simple, then I think that there's an encouragement there, but also to embrace the tension at the same time. So we will connect with you in different areas, classrooms, next time on the CCC event, but appreciate you watching and joining us for the afternoon here.